General for her service. I note that GC strategy has been prohibited from government contracts for 7 years, and it's that standard, the minimum. As a member of Canada's new government and a new member of Parliament, we will uphold higher standards, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister Mark Carney on the defense there after a damning report from the government's top watchdog, the Auditor General, who's now completed a big investigation into 9 years of contracts awarded to the company contracted to develop the ArriveCan app. Remember that? It's a COVID-era, much maligned border control app with a price tag that ballooned from $80,000 to almost $60 million. The AG found that the company received 106 contracts from 2015 to 2024. $65 million was paid out to the company, with a max value on those contracts, a maximum value of $90 million. The watchdog also found issues with procurement rules, a lack of evidence all work had been completed, and a failure to ensure everyone working had obtained security clearance. Notably, the Auditor General made no recommendations in the report, saying that the government doesn't need more procurement rules, they just need to follow the ones in place. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre responded outside the House. Have a listen.
Today's Auditor General's report, which I have today in my hands, today's Auditor General's reports, I should say, are a chronicle of liberal incompetence and an orgy of liberal waste. We're calling on the government to get our money back. They need to go to GC Strategies and get our money back so taxpayers can be made whole.
For more on all of this, we're joined live in studio by the Auditor General herself, Karen Hogan. Hi, Ms. Hogan. Good to have you back here.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for making the time. If I could, I want to start just because it's been a while since all of this happened at the beginning, which is around ArriveCan and primarily GC Strategies. So the contracts to GC Strategies that you largely investigated. What is GC Strategies and why was it contracted by the government?
So GC Strategies is an IT staffing company. So they don't do IT work themselves. They find resources to carry out the work that the government would like to have done. So they were the main contractor who was tasked with developing the ArriveCan app. And following that audit report, the House of Commons passed a unanimous motion asking me to go look at all contracts issued by the public service to them over a period of almost a decade. And what I found was what I expected to find. If you remember, after ArriveCan, I issued a report on professional services linked to the firm McKinsey. And at that time, I said I had no reason to believe that the lack of following procurement rules was solely linked to one vendor. And this audit is just confirming that. We have another 31 federal organizations in this audit with contracts with GC Strategies. And what we found is they often ignored or disregarded procurement rules that were in place meant to ensure fairness, transparency, and good value for money.
So in layman's terms, when you say that essentially the rules exist, but there's evidence now more widespread that they weren't being followed, like what are some examples of things that they didn't do that they should have?
So I'll give you two examples. One is that if they identify that security requirements are needed, that resources need to have a certain level of security clearance because they might have access to sensitive information or sensitive IT systems, that someone responsible to manage that contract should make sure that the resource has a security clearance in place. We saw that about half of the contracts we looked at needed security clearances, but we found in 21% of the files that there was no evidence on file that they had checked security clearances. So that puts government information and systems at risk. The second example I would give is that almost 94% of the contracts required timesheets to demonstrate who had worked and how long they had worked. And we found that in almost 70% of the case, they didn't gather that evidence that they needed. So they accepted poor documentation or no documentation to really demonstrate who had done what work, and yet they authorized payments. And that just leaves you in a place where you question whether good value for money was actually received.
And it's not the first time you're raising that question or providing some context for an answer. Do you have a sense of why? Like, why was there is there such disregard for the rules?
So it's a question I asked myself back during the first work on professional services, and that's why I decided not to issue recommendations here today. I don't believe that the government needs more procurement rules. I think they need to take a step back and make sure that all the rules that are in place are well understood and then that they are being applied. But I also recommend that the government look at whether they could simplify things. Over the years, my office has issued lots of recommendations on procurement. There's the procurement ombuds, there's internal audit groups across the federal public service, and we just keep adding to those rules. And I think it's time to say, are there too many, and can we speed up procurement? And is that a reason that we're seeing the kind of behavior that we're seeing?
Have you seen any evidence that the government, excuse me, is taking seriously the problem as you lay it out, insofar as there is an issue in the public service where these rules are being disregarded? Is the government, in your view, doing enough to counter that?
So each and every department has to be accountable and responsible for the procurement decisions they make. But Public Service and Procurement Canada, who is sort of the procurement specialist for the government, took action right after ArriveCan and McKinsey. But they added a few more rules and a few more steps. And that's why I think it's time to sort of take that step back and say, why are we seeing the behavior that we're seeing? Are there too many rules so people don't understand or know that they all exist? Or in order to serve Canadians better, they're circumventing some of them to speed up the process. You know, what is that root cause? And then you can really make sure that you have the right rules in place.
Do you have any sense if the people who are skirting the rules feel there are consequences to doing so?
So the individuals we talked to throughout the audit on GC strategies, at times they were surprised that there was something that they hadn't done, or they felt that they did it and just didn't go far enough. You know, the consequences are that when you're given a delegation of authority, especially one where you're allowed to authorize the spending of public funds, if you're not following those rules, the department can take that delegation away and then give you proper training before they give it back. So I'd expect to see that there'll just be a reminder about the basics, what rules are there and why they should be followed.
Should there be some political accountability? I found it interesting today that the primary response from the government was essentially like, we're not doing business anymore with this one company, and we've put, you know, a 7-year kind of hold or ban on doing so. Like, does there need to be, and I've interviewed multiple ministers as your reports came out who were in those positions of authority at the time, who responded to me that they were unaware that all of this was going on until, you know, there was reporting on it or your own investigation. Like, do people in political positions need to ask more questions about value for money? Like, is there any evidence that they have been?
Well, ministers are typically not involved in day-to-day procurement transactions, right? We did see a minister involved back in the work that we did on McKinsey, but because it was such a large dollar value and the procurement rules required a minister to be involved. So I wouldn't expect that they would know about day-to-day transactions. I would expect that they'll ask about value for money because that's one of the foundations for having all of these rules in place. I think that this is about just reminding everyone in the public service why the rules exist, because we didn't look at the work of a vendor. And I have no reason to believe that the lack of following the rules is linked to a specific vendor. This is really about the public service. This audit had 31 federal organizations. The first audit on professional services had 20. So this is a lot of federal organizations just not applying the rules that exist.
I guess on this one subject, then I conclude by asking, like, how widespread when it comes to outsourcing do you anticipate at this juncture the not following the rules might be? And I ask because even though the government had promised last year to decrease spending in that area, it actually ended up increasing, I believe, according to the Globe and Mail's analysis, by 13%. And I'm asking, like, also against the backdrop of, like, Canadians who are tapped out, who keep handing money over to the government and want to make sure that there's value. It's not a bad thing, but want to make sure that there's value for what their hard-earned money pays for.
Many of the public servants that we interviewed throughout this audit said to us that the services were received, the final goods were there, but they had no evidence for it. And that's why it makes it really hard for us to conclude whether value for money was achieved. And the procurement rules are clear in this respect, right? Document why you made the decisions that you make, show that you made the best possible decision, that this is the best price, that you went to get a good competitive price, and then demonstrate that you received what you contracted for. Those are really foundational elements to demonstrate value for money, and I think the public service just needs to go back to the basics.
So another big report you did today was on F-35. So that is, for everyone watching, many of whom are familiar with this, the fighter jets that we are in the process, sort of procuring to replace an aging fleet of CF-18s. There's a pause right now because it's under review, given what's going on with the United States. But you looked at the costs that have increased for F-35s. I thought the most interesting thing you found, though, was around our own readiness. When we do, or if we do end up procuring them, to actually man them, to pilot them, to house them. What did you find there?
So that was the point of our audit, actually, was to see if national defense was on the right track to be ready to receive the fleet of new fighter jets and to transition. And we found a few things. We found that the facilities that are going to be needed for these new aircraft are about 3 years behind schedule. And so there's a need for interim facilities because the first aircraft should arrive in Canada in 2028. So that's going to increase the costs even more than the costs that are in our report. But a bigger concern, no matter what plane the government purchases, is to have qualified pilots. And this is something we flagged back in 2018 when we did work on CF-18s. And we're finding that same risk again here. The National Defense has a plan, but their plan projects that they will not have enough qualified pilots. And really, that's something they need to address right now.
Has any of that been mitigated since 2018 when you first identified it as a problem?
Well, I think it'll be a different problem. Right now, you're going to need pilots who can fly both aircraft or enough trained pilots for CF-18s and CF-35. So it's about upskilling existing pilots and then hiring new pilots and making sure that they're trained on that aircraft. So it's a slightly different risk, but still the same risk of making sure that you can have a big fleet, but you need the pilots and you need the trained technicians to take care of that fleet.
Did you see any evidence of that being the case?
Well, there is this plan, as I said, but currently the plan is projecting that there'll be a gap in qualified pilots. And that's one of the other findings that we had, was that risk management here really seems to be more reactive. When a risk occurs, a plan's put in place to try and deal with it, instead of being more proactive and mitigating and get ahead of those risks.
Okay, I'll leave it on that note. Ms. Hogan, thanks so much for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.